August 1968. Abbey Road Studios, London. The Beatles are recording the White Album during one of their most turbulent periods. John Lennon has been increasingly distant, his marriage to Cynthia crumbling as his affair with Yoko Ono becomes impossible to hide. Late one night, during a heated recording session, Cynthia appears unannounced at the studio with their 5-year-old son, Julian. What she witnesses breaks her heart. What John says next stops the entire session and brings grown men to tears. This is the night John Lennon faced the consequences of his choices, and the moment that changed the Beatles forever. The clock read 2:47 a.m. Abbey Road Studios was alive with tension. John Lennon sat at the piano, cigarette burning between his fingers, eyes fixed on nothing. Paul was arguing with George Martin about a guitar track. Ringo tapped his drumsticks nervously against his knee. George Harrison stood in the corner, silent as always. But something was different tonight. The air felt heavier, darker, like a storm was building, and no one could stop it. It was August 22nd, 1968. The Beatles were in the middle of recording what would later be known as the White Album. But this wasn't the joyful creative collaboration that had defined their early years. This was warfare. Creative differences had turned into personal battles. Egos clashed like cymbals, and at the center of it all was John Lennon, pulling away from everything he'd built. His marriage was falling apart. His relationship with Paul was fractured. And Yoko Ono was always there, sitting silently in the corner of the studio, her presence a constant reminder that everything had changed. The other Beatles hated it. Not Yoko herself necessarily, but what she represented. The end of an era. The breaking of a brotherhood. "John, we need to do another take," Paul said, his voice tight with frustration. John didn't respond. He just stared at the piano keys, lost somewhere the others couldn't reach. "John!" Paul's voice was sharper now. "I heard you the first time," John muttered, not looking up. George Martin, the producer who'd shepherded them through everything, exchanged a worried glance with the engineer. This session was going nowhere. They'd been at it for 6 hours and had barely completed one usable track. Ringo stood up, stretching his back. "Maybe we should call it a night, lads. We're all knackered." "We're not leaving until we finish this," Paul insisted. "Then we'll be here forever," George Harrison said quietly from his corner. The words hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew what he meant. This wasn't just about one song. This was about whether the Beatles could survive it all. John finally looked up. His eyes were red, whether from exhaustion or something else, no one could tell. "Let's just get this over with," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. That's when they heard it. Footsteps in the hallway outside. Then voices. One of them was a woman, and one of them was a child. The door to Studio 2 opened slowly, and standing there, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor, was Cynthia Lennon. She was holding the hand of 5-year-old Julian. The little boy was in his pajamas, clutching a stuffed toy. The entire studio froze. John's face went white. Yoko, sitting in her usual spot, straightened slightly, but said nothing. Paul, George, and Ringo exchanged shocked glances. No one had expected this. Cynthia Lennon never came to the studio, especially not at 3 in the morning, especially not with Julian. "Hello, John," Cynthia said quietly. Her voice was steady, but anyone could hear the pain underneath. John stood up from the piano, his cigarette falling to the floor. "Cyn, what are you doing here?" "Julian wanted to see his father," she said simply. The little boy looked around the studio with wide eyes, taking in the instruments, the equipment, the strange adults staring at him. "Daddy," Julian said softly. That one word cut through the room like a knife. John took a step forward, then stopped. He looked at his son, then at Cynthia, then at Yoko, trapped between 3 worlds, belonging fully to none. What happened next would become the most talked about moment in Beatles history. But few people would ever know the full truth, until now. Cynthia Powell had loved John Lennon since they were art students. She'd been there before the fame, before the screaming crowds, before the world knew his name. She'd supported him through the Hamburg days when the Beatles were nobody playing in dirty clubs for drunk sailors. She'd married him in secret, pregnant with Julian, because Brian Epstein thought a married Beatle would hurt the band's image. She'd raised their son alone while John toured the world. She'd smiled for cameras while her heart was breaking. And now, standing in Abbey Road Studios at 3 in the morning, she'd reached her limit. "We need to talk," Cynthia said, her eyes never leaving John's face. "This isn't the time," John replied, glancing nervously at the others. "There's never a time, is there, John? You're always busy, always recording, always somewhere else." Paul cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Maybe we should step outside, give them some privacy." "No," Cynthia interrupted. "Stay. All of you should hear this." She walked further into the studio, Julian still holding her hand. The little boy yawned, confused about why he wasn't in bed. "Julian hasn't seen you in 3 weeks, John. 3 weeks. Do you know what he asks me every night? When is Daddy coming home? And I don't know what to tell him anymore." John's jaw clenched. "I've been working. You know that." "Working," Cynthia repeated, and there was something dangerous in her voice now. "Is that what we're calling it?" She looked directly at Yoko for the first time. Yoko met her gaze calmly, expressionless. The tension in the room was suffocating. Ringo looked like he wanted to disappear. George Harrison stared at the floor. Paul watched John with something that looked like disappointment. "Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning." Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. "Sin, please," John said, his voice breaking slightly. "Not here. Not like this." "Where then, John? Our home that you haven't slept in for 2 months? The phone that you never answer when I call?" Cynthia's voice was getting louder now, years of suppressed pain finally breaking through. "I came here tonight because Julian drew you a picture at school today. He was so excited to show you. He carried it all the way home, protecting it like treasure. And when I told him you probably wouldn't be home tonight either, he cried himself to sleep." She reached into her purse and pulled out a piece of construction paper. On it, a child's drawing of a family. A mommy, a daddy, and a little boy holding hands. Underneath, in shaky letters, "I miss you, Daddy." Cynthia held it up for everyone to see. Julian, sensing his mother's distress, started to cry softly. John stood frozen, staring at his son's drawing. Something was breaking inside him. Everyone in that studio could see it. "He made me promise to give this to you personally," Cynthia continued, her own voice shaking now. "He said maybe if you saw it, you'd remember us. Remember that you have a family." She walked closer to John and held out the drawing. John took it with trembling hands. He looked at the picture, the crude figures holding hands. The crooked smile on the daddy's face, the son in the corner with rays like a child's fingers, and something inside John Lennon shattered completely. He sank to his knees right there in the middle of Abbey Road Studios. The drawing clutched in his hands, and he began to sob. Not quiet tears, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal. The sound of a man who'd been running from himself, finally colliding with the truth. Julian ran to his father, small arms wrapped around John's neck. "Don't cry, Daddy. I'm here now." Those innocent words destroyed John even more. Paul turned away, wiping his own eyes. Ringo openly cried. George Harrison's face was a mask of pain. Even George Martin, the stoic producer who'd seen everything, looked shaken. John held his son like a drowning man holds a lifeline. "I'm sorry," he whispered into Julian's hair. "I'm so sorry, Jules." Cynthia stood watching, tears streaming down her face. This was the man she'd loved for over a decade. The brilliant, complicated, damaged man who'd written songs that changed the world, but who couldn't seem to hold his own family together. After a long moment, John gently released Julian and stood up. He looked at Cynthia with red eyes. "You're right," he said, his voice hoarse. "About everything, you're right." Then he did something that shocked everyone. He turned to face Paul, George, and Ringo. "I need to say something. All of you need to hear this." The Beatles gathered closer, sensing something important was about to happen. "I've been a terrible father," John began, his voice breaking. "I've been a terrible husband, and I've been a terrible bandmate." "John," Paul started. "No, let me finish, please." John took a shaky breath. "I've been so caught up in my own head, my own pain, my own searching for something, that I've destroyed everything good in my life." He looked at Cynthia. "You deserved better than me. You always did. You gave me a son, a home, stability, and I threw it away because I was too selfish, too scared, too broken to appreciate it." He looked at Julian. "And you, Jules, you're 5 years old. You shouldn't have to beg your father for attention. You shouldn't have to draw pictures to remind me you exist." The little boy was crying again, not understanding everything but feeling the weight of it. John turned to his bandmates. "And you three, we built something incredible together, something that changed music forever. But I've let my personal chaos poison it. I've made every session a battle. I've brought my relationship drama into our workspace. I've put my needs above the band's." He paused, looking at Yoko, who sat motionless in the corner. "I'm not blaming anyone else. This is on me. My choices. My failures." George Harrison spoke for the first time in an hour. "John, we all have our struggles. You're not the only one. But I'm the one whose struggles are tearing everything apart," John interrupted. "And I'm the one who needs to face it." He walked over to the piano where he'd been sitting earlier. "I wrote something tonight. Before you all got here. I haven't shown it to anyone." He sat down at the keys. His hands were shaking. "This is for Julian, and for Cynthia, and for all the ways I failed as a father and a man." What John played next was a melody none of them had heard before. Gentle, heartbreaking, raw, and then he began to sing. The lyrics were simple but devastating, about a father who was never there, about a little boy waiting by the window, about time slipping away like water through fingers, about love that exists but can't seem to bridge the distance. By the time John finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the studio. Even Yoko had tears on her cheeks. Cynthia was sobbing openly. Paul had his face in his hands. Ringo was shaking with emotion. George Harrison looked like he'd witnessed something sacred. The song would later evolve and change. But in that moment, it was the purest expression of regret and love John Lennon had ever created. "That's beautiful, Daddy," Julian whispered. John pulled his son onto his lap. "You deserve more than a beautiful song, Jules. You deserve a father who shows up." He looked up at Cynthia. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that I see what I've done. I see the pain I've caused, and I'm going to try to do better." Cynthia wiped her eyes. "John, we can't keep living like this. Something has to change." "I know," John said softly. "I know." The studio remained silent for a long moment. George Martin finally spoke. "Perhaps we should end the session for tonight. This is more important than any recording." Paul nodded in agreement. "John, take your family home. We can finish tomorrow." But John shook his head. "No, I need to say something else. Something I should have said months ago. He gently set Julian down and stood up. This band, the Beatles, it saved my life once. When my mum died, when I was lost and angry and didn't know who I was, this band gave me purpose. He looked at each of his bandmates. Paul, you and I created magic together. Songs that neither of us could have written alone. And I've been so competitive, so jealous of your talent, that I've poisoned our partnership. Paul's eyes widened. George, you've grown into an incredible songwriter. And instead of celebrating that, I've dismissed your contributions. Made you feel like you don't matter as much. George Harrison's face showed surprise and pain. And Ringo, you're the heart of this band, the glue that holds us together, and I've taken that for granted. Ringo nodded, unable to speak. The truth is, John continued, his voice getting stronger. I've been running away. From my marriage, from fatherhood, from the responsibility of being a Beatle. I convinced myself that the band was holding me back, that I needed to break free, to find myself. He laughed bitterly. But all I've done is get more lost. Cynthia stepped forward. John, I didn't come here to make you choose between your family and your music. I came because Julian needed to see you, because he needed to know his father still exists. But I do have to choose, don't I? John said quietly. Between the person I've been and the person I need to become. He walked over to where Yoko sat. She looked up at him with those intense, dark eyes. I care about you, John said to her. That's not a lie, but I've used you as an escape, as a way to avoid dealing with my real problems. Yoko didn't respond, but something flickered across her face. John turned back to Cynthia. I don't know if our marriage can be saved. I don't know if I deserve another chance. But Julian deserves a father, and I'm going to be that, whether you and I are together or not. Cynthia's expression softened slightly. That's all I've ever wanted, John, for you to be present in his life. Julian, confused by all the adult conversation, tugged on John's sleeve. Can we go home now, baby? I'm sleepy. John picked up his son. Yeah, Jules, let's go home. He looked at Paul, George, and Ringo. I'm sorry for everything. For the tension, the arguments, the drama. You three are my brothers, and I've been a lousy brother. Paul stepped forward and put his hand on John's shoulder. We're all struggling, mate. The pressure, the fame, the expectations, we've all made mistakes. But none of you abandoned your families for a fantasy, John said. George spoke up. We've all been so caught up in our own worlds, we stopped seeing each other. Stopped really listening. Ringo added, maybe this is what we all needed, a wake-up call. John held Julian closer. I need to take a break from recording, just for a little while. I need to figure out how to be a father again. Paul looked concerned. The album can wait, John interrupted firmly. For the first time in 10 years, something matters more than the music. The words hung heavy in the air. This was unprecedented. The Beatles never stopped, never slowed down. They were a machine that kept producing hit after hit. But John Lennon was choosing his son over the band. And everyone in that room knew what that meant. The beginning of the end had already started. Cynthia gathered their things. Julian was falling asleep on John's shoulder. But before they could leave, George Harrison said something that changed the entire conversation. John, can I tell you something? Something I've never told anyone. Everyone turned to look at George. He was usually the quiet one, the observer. But now his face was filled with emotion. When my father was dying 2 years ago, I was on tour. I got the telegram that he was in hospital, critical condition. And you know what I did? He paused, his voice breaking. I finished the tour. I told myself the fans needed me, that the band needed me. And my father died alone in a hospital room in Liverpool, while I was singing on stage in America. Tears were streaming down George's face now. I never got to say goodbye. Never got to tell him I loved him. Never got to thank him for supporting my music when everyone else said it was a waste of time. He looked directly at John. So when you say you're choosing your son over the music, you're making the right choice, John. The only choice that matters. Ringo spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. I barely see my kids either. I tell myself they're too young to understand, that they won't remember. But they will remember. They'll remember that their father was always somewhere else. Paul, usually the optimistic one, looked haunted. We've all sacrificed our families for this dream. And maybe we need to ask ourselves if it was worth it. The question hung in the air like a ghost. Was fame worth the cost? Were the screaming crowds worth missing your child's first steps? Were the #1 hits worth dying alone in a hospital room? John looked at each of his bandmates with new understanding. They were all damaged, all struggling, all paying prices they'd never anticipated when they were just young lads from Liverpool dreaming of making music. We can't keep living like this, John said quietly. None of us can. George Martin, who'd been silent through all of this, finally spoke. Gentlemen, I've worked with many artists over the years, brilliant musicians, successful bands, but I've never seen a group sacrifice as much as you four have. He removed his glasses and cleaned them, a gesture they all recognized as him buying time to collect his thoughts. The music you've created has brought joy to millions. It's changed culture, politics, consciousness itself. But at what cost to yourselves? No one had an answer. Maybe, George Martin continued, it's time to redefine what success means. Maybe it's not about the next album or the next tour. Maybe it's about being able to look your children in the eye and know you were there for them. Cynthia, who'd been quiet during this exchange, spoke up. I don't hate the Beatles. I never have. The music is important. But John, you're important too. Not just as a Beatle, but as a person, as a father, as a human being with needs and limits. She walked closer to him. You can't save the world if you're destroying yourself. And you can't write songs about love and peace if you're abandoning the people who love you most. Her words cut deeper than any criticism, because they were true. John had become a prophet for a generation, a voice for peace, for revolution, for change. But he couldn't even keep his own family intact. I'm a hypocrite, John said, his voice barely audible. No, Paul said firmly. You're human. We all are. And humans make mistakes. But I keep making the same ones, John argued. Then stop, George said simply. You have the power to change. You're doing it right now. Julian stirred on John's shoulder. Daddy, I love you, he murmured in his sleep. Those 4 words broke John completely. He sat down on the floor, still holding his son, and cried like he hadn't cried since he was a child himself. His bandmates gathered around him. Paul sat down next to him, George on the other side, Ringo behind, a hand on his shoulder, 4 brothers who'd conquered the world together, now sitting on a studio floor at 4 in the morning, facing the truth they'd all been running from. They were just men, talented, yes, famous, certainly, but underneath the suits and the songs and the screaming, they were just men trying to figure out how to live. Cynthia watched this scene with tears in her eyes. This was what she'd hoped for when she came to the studio. Not a dramatic confrontation, but truth. Real, painful, necessary truth. When John finally composed himself, Julian was fully asleep. The little boy's face was peaceful, trusting. He didn't know that this moment would change his father's life. He just knew Daddy was holding him. And that was enough. John stood up carefully, not wanting to wake his son. Paul, he said quietly, can we talk? Just us for a minute? Paul nodded, and the 2 of them walked to the corner of the studio. The other Beatles gave them space, sensing this conversation needed privacy. I've been jealous of you, John admitted, his voice low. Your talent, your ease with melody, the way songs just flow out of you, while I struggle with every line. Paul looked surprised. "John, you're the most naturally gifted songwriter I've ever met. Your lyrics cut to the bone. You say things no one else dares to say." "But you make it look easy," John said, "and I've resented you for that. I've picked fights, dismissed your ideas, tried to diminish your contributions because I was insecure." Paul was quiet for a moment. "I've been jealous of you too, you know." Now it was John's turn to look surprised. "Your authenticity," Paul continued, "your fearlessness. You write from the gut, from the soul. My songs are polished and pretty, but yours change people." They looked at each other, really looked, for the first time in months. "We've wasted so much time competing," John said, "when we could have been creating," Paul finished. They embraced, two old friends, rediscovering what they'd lost. When they returned to the group, something had shifted. The air felt lighter, not resolved, but possible. John turned to George. "Play me one of your new songs, one you've been trying to get us to listen to." George's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really. I want to hear it, not as a critic, but as your mate." George picked up his guitar with shaking hands. What he played was beautiful, spiritual, complex, mature. When he finished, John said simply, "That's brilliant, George. Why haven't we been listening to you?" "Because we've been too busy listening to ourselves," George replied. The truth of that statement settled over all of them. Ringo spoke up. "What happens now? With the band, I mean." John looked at Julian, still sleeping in his arms. "I don't know, but I know we can't keep doing what we've been doing. It's killing us." "Maybe we take a real break," Paul suggested. "Not just a week or two. A real break where we all go home, spend time with our families, remember who we are outside of being Beatles." "And then?" Ringo asked. "Then we see if the Beatles still make sense," John said. "If we can come back together as better men, maybe we can create better music." George Martin interjected. "Or maybe you create something different. Not better or worse, just different. True to who you are now, not who you were in 1963. Cynthia checked her watch. "It's almost 5 in the morning. Julian needs to be in bed." John nodded. "Can I come home? Tonight? I know I don't deserve to, but—" "Yes," Cynthia interrupted. "You can come home." Hope flickered in John's eyes. "Thank you." As they prepared to leave, John turned back to his bandmates one more time. "I love you, lads. I don't say it enough, but I do. You're my brothers." "We love you too, John," Paul said, speaking for all of them. George and Ringo nodded in agreement. "We'll sort this out," Ringo added, "whatever it takes." John carried Julian out of Abbey Road Studios. Cynthia walked beside him. Not holding his hand, not yet, but beside him. And that was a start. The 3 Beatles who remained stood in the studio, watching them go. "Think you'll be all right?" Ringo asked. "I don't know," Paul admitted, "but I think tonight was necessary, for all of us." George strummed his guitar absently. "Everything changes. People change. Maybe the Beatles need to change too." "Or end," Paul said quietly. The words no one wanted to speak aloud, but they all knew it was true. The Beatles as they'd always been, couldn't survive. Something had to give, someone had to grow, and growth meant change. Even if that change was painful. John Lennon did go home that night. He carried Julian upstairs and tucked him into bed. He sat in the chair beside his son's bed and watched him sleep until the sun came up. And he made a promise, not to be perfect, not to fix everything overnight, but to try, to be present, to choose his son over his ego. The marriage between John and Cynthia didn't survive. Some wounds go too deep. Some trust, once broken, can't be fully repaired. They divorced the following year, but something did change. John became more involved in Julian's life. Not perfect, never perfect, but present in a way he hadn't been before. He wrote songs for his son. He made time for visits. He tried to be the father Julian deserved. The Beatles never fully recovered from that night either. The White Album was completed, but the sessions were different, more honest, more painful, more real. They took a break after the album was finished. Each Beatle went home to their families, their own lives, and when they came back together, they were different people. The magic was still there in flashes. Abbey Road would be their last masterpiece, but the brotherhood had fractured in ways that couldn't be undone. By 1970, the Beatles were over. Four men going their separate ways, chasing different dreams, building different lives. But that night in August 1968 remained with all of them. Paul McCartney later said in interviews that it was the moment he realized fame had costs he'd never calculated. George Harrison credited it with pushing him toward spirituality, toward finding meaning beyond music. Ringo Starr made more effort to be present in his children's lives. And John Lennon, complicated and brilliant and damaged John Lennon, carried the memory of his son's drawing for the rest of his life. Years later, when Julian was grown, he spoke about that night. "I don't remember much of it. I was so young, but I remember my dad holding me and crying. I remember feeling like something important was happening, even if I didn't understand what." He paused, emotional himself now. "My father wasn't perfect. He made a lot of mistakes, but I know he tried. And that night at Abbey Road, that was when he started trying." The song John wrote that night was never officially released, but bootleg recordings exist. Collectors treasure them, not for the music, though it's beautiful, but for the raw honesty, for the sound of a man breaking open and trying to put himself back together. Cynthia Lennon, before her death, was asked about that night. "It didn't save our marriage," she said, "but it saved John's relationship with his son, and that mattered more than anything else." The story of what happened at Abbey Road Studios on August 22, 1968, became legend among those who were there. But few people knew the full truth, until now. It reminds us that behind every famous face is a human being. Behind every great artist is someone struggling with the same things we all struggle with: love, family, purpose. The question of whether what we're chasing is worth what we're leaving behind. John Lennon wrote songs that changed the world, but on that night, his 5-year-old son changed him. With a simple drawing, with 3 words, "I miss you." Sometimes the most powerful music isn't played on instruments. It's played in the silences between people, in the moments when we stop performing and start being real. That night, John Lennon stopped being a Beatle for a few hours and remembered how to be a father. That was his greatest performance. Not the one captured on tape, but the one witnessed by his son. The one that said through tears and broken promises and desperate hope, "I'm here, I'm trying, I love you." And sometimes that's the only song that matters. If this story of redemption and struggle moved you, subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose what really matters. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had a moment that changed everything? We're building a community of people who believe in second chances and real human connection. Don't miss what's coming next.